Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. It's been a week of intimations of Democratic backsliding come January 20th, with very little to allay concerns that Trump 2.0 aims to remove, ignore, or mow down the long-standing guardrails of constitutional rule. Even inaugurations have their well-established norms and laws of disclosure, of funding, of ethics, of freedom from personal conflicts. Yet, as we tick off the weeks until Donald Trump takes the oath of office, assuming he opts to take the oath of office, Trump and his surrounding enablers are picking and choosing which to follow and which to ignore. Only last week did Trump's campaign staff get around to signing an ethics pledge that was due back in October, though Trump himself has flatly refused to sign it. The financing of the transition and inauguration remain a black box, with no transparency about which oligarch wannabes are whispering in Trump's ear. And one of Trump's closest advisors, Boris Epshteyn, looks to have been caught lining his own pockets, demanding retainers from applicants for administration positions in return for putting in a good word. Meanwhile, Special Counsel Jack Smith, after 2 years of work building two compelling criminal cases against the former and future president, moved to dismiss both, likely extinguishing the most serious efforts to hold Donald Trump accountable. There will be unanticipated twists and turns, blunders and scandals, and perhaps surprising acts of resistance that may blunt Trump's authoritarian ambitions. But 7 weeks out from January 20th, there's very little cause for being sanguine. To take stock of Trump's improbable, even astonishing emergence from a set of criminal charges to rival Al Capone, and to chronicle the first signs of an authoritarian administration in the making, we welcome three terrific commentators and Talking Feds MVPs. And they are Jen Rubin. Jen is an opinion columnist for The Washington Post, an MSNBC contributor and host of Jen Rubin's Green Room. Prior to her career in journalism, she worked as a labor law attorney for 2 decades. She's the author of the book, Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump.
It's always fun.
Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Washington and is a host of the Political Scene podcast. Welcome back, Susan.
Hey, great to be with you. Thank you so much.
And Charlie Sykes, a founder and former editor-at-large of The Bulwark, an MSNBC contributor, ostensibly, and the author of 9 books, most recently, How the Right Lost Its Mind. His Substack newsletter, which has, I gotta say, just been crushing it of late, is called To the Contrary. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, by one way of looking at it, it seems clear to me that Trump has achieved his high water mark in American political life and in history with election night itself. And then in the 3 weeks since, he's been filling out a prospective cabinet, more about that later, and in some sense beginning to govern. Not surprisingly, the trends are concerning. So let's start with the turmoil and ethical shortcuts within the transition operation. The team is just rejecting many of the sort of orthodox aspects of a presidential transition process. Until this week, nobody would sign the mandatory ethics pledge. It's keeping donors secret. It's taking no federal funding in order to keep things secret. Trump himself hasn't done an ethics pledge. There are more. So let's start here. Do we know, just from independent reporting, who are the figures that are most have Trump's ear, who are not in the government and are presumably expecting support in return?
Well, I think that with Donald Trump, you can't just say one person, because it's important to stipulate at the outset of this conversation and for the next 4 years that Donald Trump believes that Donald Trump is really the only voice that matters on pretty much any decision. And so obviously one of the hazards, I think, as people are looking for navigational aids to the second term is to understand that you can only go so far by parsing the thoughts, background, opinions, ideas, policies, and predilections of those surrounding Donald Trump, because they definitely matter. And we can talk about the ways in which they matter, but it's also true that Donald Trump may appoint someone for reasons that have nothing to do with his or her policies, and in fact may disagree very strongly with them, but he put them in because they look good on television, or because he feels that they address or speak to a particular constituency that he wants to please in some way. So I think that's very important at the outset to say, like, Kremlinology, or in this case, Trumpology, is going to be very important, because the normal, transparent ways in which we cover government as journalists, as observers, don't always apply to Donald Trump. You mentioned the refusal to sign basic ethics pledges or transparency pledges when it comes to raising money for government. These are the norms that have really governed the American government, with some ebbs and flows, since certainly the end of the Watergate era. This was the set of reforms, broadly speaking, put in place in order for there not to be lack of transparency and influence. But I think, Trump is just a radical shift in the other direction there. That being said, there are a large number of billionaires who contributed greatly to Trump's reelection, mostly through non-transparent super PACs or dark money groups. Many of them are already pressing their preferred appointees in this administration, and they will be looking for policy payback as well. For example, the crypto industry, something that Donald Trump flip-flopped on very dramatically. I wrote about this in my New Yorker piece, but Trump basically called crypto a scam, and Bitcoin said it's very suspicious. And then in the course of this election year, did a complete 180 and became the biggest proponent of crypto, actually attended in Nashville their annual Bitcoin conference in the middle of the campaign. This is highly unusual, to say the least. Promised very explicit things to the crypto industry, even included those in his otherwise very sparse Republican national platform that was adopted this summer at the RNC. So the crypto industry, that's one example. Howard Lutnick, who just became the Commerce Secretary, who is a co-chair of his transition, also one of the most outspoken crypto proponents. That's just one example of many. Obviously, we can go through the list of things, but I'll stop there, Harry.
I'm concerned actually about two things. One is the advisors, the people whispering in his ear with a Russian accent. We cannot forget that he is listening to people outside the purview of the State Department. They are not on these calls. We obviously have reason to believe that he's been talking to all sorts of foreign leaders throughout the Biden presidency. And what they may be pressing him to do, asking him to be doing, we really don't know. And that's the thing that concerns me the most. We can imagine that the crypto guys are going to be pushing him. We can imagine that, there's going to be a push for deregulation from finance people, but it's the Kremlin people that I'm most concerned about. And frankly, any other place that Trump has investments or personal interest in, Saudi Arabia, for example. So that's what concerns me most. I would say we have moved so far that Trump no longer even goes through the motions. Remember last time he had this phony blind trust that was never a blind trust, really? He's not even bothering, and no one is raising that because we're so far past any kind of, normalcy. So it's just a given now that we're going to see massive corruption. And frankly, we're only going to know about it because there'll be whistleblowers or there'll be some civil lawsuit in which something comes up. But what we don't know is going to, I think at times, outweigh what we do know.
Yeah, look, and I just want to add, last time they at least signed the pledge. I remember there were some pretty big ethical problems early on in the administration, but here in perfect Trumpian fashion, they said they would, and they just didn't. And this is a pretty benign promise not to have conflicts of interest. Even that is too much for the Trump folks. Do you think we have, on top of all the kind of curating carefully of government folks to be strictly loyal to Trump, a problem of almost oligarchs, Jen raised the Russian accent, an actual influential folks who are utterly outside of any mechanisms of accountability?
If I was giving an answer, I would struggle not to use the word oligarchy and kakistocracy. And I do think that we need to pull the lens back and, let me put it a different way, we need to embrace the suck here. The return of Donald Trump is an extraordinary moment. And I think that we are still trying to process what it means. He, however, I think has processed it, that he can do anything he wants, that all of the norms, all of the guardrails have been blown up. Now, that sounds like something we've been saying for the last few years, but whether you're talking about, and things like not signing the ethics forms, I have to say, it's just a minor symptom of this larger process of somebody who is going to re-enter the Oval Office thinking that he doesn't have to worry about being accountable in any way. He doesn't have to worry about criminal prosecutions. He doesn't have to worry about ethics watchdogs. He and his buddies can do whatever they want. In part, that will be retribution, but it will also be rewarding. Donald Trump will sit there and govern with fear and favor. And he knows that what are the consequences? Impeachment's a dead letter. The Department of Justice has folded its tents. The Supreme Court has basically said he's immune, has wide immunity. And the voters, let's be honest, didn't give a shit. I mean, the thing that we need to really get our heads around is there was nothing about Donald Trump that was not unknown. There was nothing about Donald Trump's character or his ethics that was not reported and documented in great length. Everybody here has been doing this now for 9 years. Nothing was left unsaid. The campaign itself was pure undiluted Trumpism. I was just rereading Susan's column about the Madison Square Garden rally. And again, it really sort of captured it, just sort of, the kind of the ugliness and the way that the audience, when saying that we support him in spite of that, they were eating it up. So I think that part of it we need to just sort of get our heads around how enormous the enormity of all of this is. And that Donald Trump knows that none of those rules and guidelines apply to him or the people around him. Now, by the way, the people around him. So one of the stories we got this week was that one of his closest cronies, Boris Epstein, apparently has been selling access, tens of thousands of dollars a month in order to, get people into the cabinet and everything. As far as I know, you can correct me, he's still there. The biggest question is not whether or not there'll be corruption. The biggest question in my mind is whether anybody but a Trump family member can engage in the corruption. Because it's a given that the Trump family can basically sell off anything. Jared Kushner can make, the $2 billion deal with the Saudis. We know how Donald Trump operates. Does this extend to a Boris Epstein? Can he also do it? But the degree of corruption is going to be so off the charts. And there's no model. You think about it, it's like, okay, compare this to Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome is First Communion compared to what we're about to see. And so I think the part of what we need to prepare ourselves for is not get caught up in the minutiae, to understand that these are all just, parts of this kaleidoscopic, oligarchical kakistocracy that we are about to see that has no precedent in American political life.
As you were saying that about a third of the way through, Charlie, as I realized how comprehensive and damning it was, I started to think, okay, is there a word that he says that I would take issue with? And the answer is clearly no. It's a really grim prognosis, but we got to, as you say, take it where we are. And the only thing I'd add is he's not just indifferent. He's, I think, triumphant and actually believes, he certainly asserts, but I think he maybe actually believes that the American people returned a verdict in the election that in fact overrides the Constitution, literally said, we want you, this is your mandate, to do what? Any friggin' thing you want. Really nothing matters. So it's gone beyond kind of indifference or even sneaking around to absolute, l'état c'est moi. If Charlie has French grandchildren, it should be the new motto instead of e pluribus unum.
Yeah, I mean, my only addendum would be to point out that, remember, Donald Trump has always essentially had the instincts of a sort of a natural born authoritarian. He talked about not breaking the Constitution. That was new to this campaign when he used the language about terminate. But even in his first term, what did he talked about a definition of the Constitution that imbues him with supreme power. What I would say that's different is that he is surrounded by a Republican Party that is much more in line with that view of truly an imperial presidency, and a Supreme Court that has now endorsed aspects of that view in its very sweeping immunity decision, which at the moment is the only sad legacy of the effort to hold Trump accountable for his attack on the Constitution, is this ruling that gives him, in effect, the power to do much of what he might want to do without fear of legal sanction. And so I think it's broader. It's basically the creation of a cadre and a way to enforce Trump's worldview. He always had this worldview. On January 20th, 2017, when he was first sworn into office, he was still the same guy. And any woman can tell you, do very bullheaded 78-year-old men change their behavior, or change their views at that age? No, of course not. He is himself. He is a sort of distilled essence of himself now. The difference is that he's gotten millions more Americans with the program, number one. Number two, what he tells them, Harry, is not that the Constitution doesn't hem me in. What he and his followers have done that I think is very, very scary to me is propounded an idea where they are saving the Constitution from you. And I think that's part of this very belated reckoning that is sort of happening and sort of not happening among Democrats about how they ended up in this place. But the truth of the matter is, Trump and his people, how did they get all those thousands at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2021? They said they were there as patriots to save America. And you and I might say, oh, yeah, but, Trump is cynical, and it's people, they were cynical and they didn't really believe that stuff. But they got people there who did really believe that stuff. And so I know we're talking in very big picture terms and we can be more specific, but I absolutely agree with Charlie that what I saw in the first few years of Putin's Russia, or what we've all observed in other countries that have had democratic backsliding in the subsequent 2 decades, in Hungary or Turkey or Poland, what's concerning here is the 8 years of time to take over institutions, whether it's the Republican Party or the Supreme Court, number one. Number two, the creation of an oligarchic class that now has the ability to accomplish a form of state capture of parts of the government that they want to either transform or eliminate. And then number three, Trump's agenda of personal revenge and retribution. That's quite different than 8 years ago. And along with that is an ideology in which I see America First now transforming into much more, not so much about a view of America and the world or foreign policy, but now it's about the enemies within. And that is a big transformation. And we can talk about that.
With some really foreboding historical precedents as well. But to put a sort of legal exclamation point on the idea of the capture of the Republican Party. It's now, whereas before it was kind of sneaking around, dealing with the consequences, there's an actual legal trappings where I think the Republican Party as a whole, and certainly everyone chosen for the cabinet and certainly the Attorney General, this is why in some ways anyway, Pam Bondi is, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, will embrace this intellectual justification that really that is the true and power, and they are completely unlimited of the executive branch. That's going to be the driving actual legal justification of the administration.
The closest I can think of is the Russian Tsar. If the Tsar only knew, because it is so personalized to him and because he has no fixed ideology, the scramble is not only for access to him, but be the last one that talks to him. And it's fascinating to see as some of these policies unspool, the people who were defending him are now a little worried they might actually come to be. I look, for example, at the tariff notion, which is one part of this larger kind of worldview. And now you have all kinds of manufacturing executives, all kinds of farm interests saying, well, I'm not so sure about this. And Trump, in Trumpian fashion, redefines what he wants so that he can't possibly lose. Remember, the idea of the tariffs was to make us completely self-sufficient, which is nutty in a globalized economy, and to generate money. Again, not acknowledging that this is a sales tax on the American people. Now it has morphed into, it's a bargaining tool to get Mexico and Canada to stop the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants. So one of two things can now happen. Either he claims, it worked, I'm such a success, and his people will buy it, and he will get the benefit of having done this without wrecking the economy, or he will go through with it anyway. Things will be very, very, very bad economically, and he'll have to figure out some way to wriggle out of it or modify it or what have you. Same thing with illegal immigration. Well, the construction industry is up in arms. 13% of their workforce is undocumented workers. So suddenly they're all bothered. So now the game is to get to Trump in such a way to help him redefine what he wanted to do anyway, so he doesn't lose face, so he gets to be the winner, so his people are never disappointed, and the interests in the oligarchy are nevertheless protected. So it's going to be this fascinating game of not only influence peddling, but kind of seducing Trump in the same way that Kim Jong-un seduced Trump, to manipulate him to thinking he won when, in fact, you're chasing him off really, really bad ideas. And I think one of the problems we're going to have is that we expect to hold him responsible for these horrible ideas, shocking ideas, in some cases with deportation, grossly immoral and inhumane ideas. They may not come to pass, and he may declare himself a victor anyway. And so I think it's important for us not to remember what he has promised, then what he has done, and then the consequences of what he has done. And that's going to be a difficult thing to do because he's going to constantly be moving the goalposts.
More generally, you got to feel the sort of poignant position of the Biden administration, kind of powerless, knowing as soon as they leave, anything good, he'll claim credit for, and anything bad, including by him, he'll ascribe to them. All right, so there is one thing that we've all said that is kind of the secret weapon against Trump, which is his own propensity for scandal and blunder. So that's why I say he really is at a high water mark. And I wanted to zero in a little bit more on what Charlie raised about Boris Epshteyn, longtime advisor, loathed within the team. He was at trial every day. I sat right behind him. And yeah, he was going to people and say, I will advocate for you. I've got Trump's ear for name the position. You pay me 10 grand, 20 grand a month. Trump did order up a report that now has been delivered and apparently really says Epshteyn did wrong, and Trump is apparently very upset. What do these allegations reveal about the sort of power plays and potential pay-to-play culture within the inner circle?
It's almost as if the swamp hasn't been drained, right? Or it's been replaced with other kinds of swamp creatures. I mean, who knew? You surrounded yourself with grifters and grafters, and people are grifting and grafting. I mean, this is amazing.
It's not new at all. And that, I think, is an important point, that there are many examples of that from Trump's first term in office. In fact, it really brings to mind a lot of the conflicts that were always swirling around Corey Lewandowski, who was his first campaign manager, who he attempted to bring back, by the way, briefly in this campaign. And that caused a huge public rift, actually, with Susie Wiles, the campaign manager, who's now going to become Trump's White House chief of staff, and his chief campaign strategist, Chris LaCivita. They basically went to war publicly with Lewandowski, who did not ever take a formal position in the first Trump White House, presumably because he was monetizing his relationships in that Trump world in a different fashion. And this is endemic to who Donald Trump is. I think anyone who has studied Trump's career and history understands that conflict, chaos, infighting, and grifting are endemic to those who surround Donald Trump. That's for a variety of reasons. Number one, Trump encourages it. He likes disagreement in his circle because that keeps him on top. Is also a way of airing out different points of view. He's interested in different points of view. He just likes people. I remember interviewing some of his officials from his first term literally saying that he would encourage an almost gladiatorial like combat among his advisors, both just for power, but also on specific decisions that needed to be made, number one. Number two, the attitude towards money. Trump is, in this sense, kind of like the boss of a family here. He doesn't want other people making side deals that are outside of his control. If, Jared is going to get rich, he should do so only with the approval of the patron. And I think that, the sin here is it a side hustle that hasn't been approved up the chain? So that's part of it. But there's, lots of grifting. By the way, I recall very similar thing happened after Trump's upset victory in 2016 with Michael Cohen, who was his then fixer and lawyer, still in Trump's good graces. Companies were desperate to answer the questions that you've just posed for us, Harry, at the outset of this conversation, which is, how do we get to Donald Trump? Who's really got influence? Who is he listening to? And they started handing out large sums of money to anyone who was associated with Trump, including Michael Cohen, who was paid large sums of money for what exactly is not clear. But I think that, again, this is how companies and business interests operate or foreign countries, by the way, when they are panicked about instability in the world's largest superpower.
And to the world's most powerful person. I mean, look, if Epstein did wrong in a regular way, who are the victims? It's the American people, right? I mean, he's got the job here is in some fashion to give objective advice in the best service, even in the warped Trumpian world. But in lieu of that, it's who's lining his pocket. And if that's the kind of MO, including of the various advisors, because you're totally right. I mean, we've had this story again and again. Manafort comes to mind, but it's people who, hey, I work for Donald Trump. I can emulate him a bit. And that means, what can I do for myself? And the last thing it means, and the next thing it might mean is what can I do for Donald Trump? But the last thing it means, it seems to me, is what can I do for the American people?
This kind of corruption is all of the bad part with none of the good part of corruption. At least Tammany Hall delivered jobs. It did things for people. So it actually got the loyalty of people who were rewarded. Your newspaper, got delivered, your garbage got picked up. Here, there's such a shit show that there's going to be very little positive that comes out of this if you're not in that immediate inner circle to make a buck. So yeah, if you're somebody who builds private prisons, you're probably licking your chops. But frankly, you might not get paid everything you're owed because people are going to be literally taking a cut off the top. None of this is to the benefit of the American people.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we look at 3 different techniques for making rosé wine to see if there's truly a best way to rosé. First, rosé is a type of wine that's actually produced quite similarly to reds, but the fermentation time of the grape is reduced, giving rosé its signature pink color. The first technique for making rosé is the skin contact method, in which black-skinned grapes such as Pinot Noir are crushed but allowed to remain in contact with the juice for a short period of time. After about 6 to 48 hours, as opposed to weeks or months for the reds, the skins are separated. This method is most frequently used in the top rosé-producing region of the world, Provence, and throughout the south of France. The second method is called saignée, which is the French word for bleeding. This method creates both a rosé and a red wine. Early in the maceration process, some of the pink juice created from the grape must is removed to make the rosé, while the remaining juice becomes a more concentrated red. A rosé made from this method tends to be richer and darker in both color and fruit flavor. This method is more rarely used, but it can be found more often in rosés from Spain, Napa, and Chile. The third method is blending. Contrary to what some people think, blending is not just a 50-50 pour of red and white wine. Instead, blending is where a white grape, such as Chardonnay, is blended with a red grape, and it's the most popular way to make a rosé champagne. Although popular in Champagne, this method is used in still rosés as well. In fact, some winemakers in Provence choose to blend small percentages of white grape varieties into their rosés. It's not always obvious or easy to know which method was used to make a particular rosé, but the expert guides at Total Wine & More can help you navigate our wondrous selection to find a rosé that makes your day. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. All right, let me do one counterpoint because there are losers in Trump's world. You named Lee Wendelsky. Actually, an interesting thing is the losers then reemerge and he comes back to them. But Matt Gaetz, he was the talk of our last week, and he was quite a horrendous pick for AG for a number of reasons. He gets the third shortest nominee in American history, so that's something like 8 days. Trump went from 100% supporting to just pulling the plug. What do you see as having caused Trump to pull the plug?
Well, reality check. Now, I don't want to get into whether or not Gaetz was a stalking horse for Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi would be a 5-alarm fire of you got to be kidding me, except in comparison to Matt Gaetz. So, by putting Gaetz up, because I have so many dark things to say here, I'm actually going to play the game of what if, a positive point. I think our default setting, and I keep having to say this because I have to say this on MSNBC, but the default setting has to be skepticism and belief that the Republicans in Congress will cave to Donald Trump as they always have. In this particular case, obviously, Donald Trump realized that, number one, there was no way that he was going to get enough votes to confirm Matt Gaetz. And his idea, and I think this is even more significant, tell me if I'm wrong, his idea of having the Senate give up its constitutional power of advice consent through the recess appointment was not going anywhere. That there's a hardcore in the Republican caucus, and there are three things. They're not going to go for Matt Gaetz. They're not going to let him make the recess appointments. And I think they're going to resist him when inevitably he begins again saying that they need to abolish the filibuster, which goes to the question of what is Mitch McConnell in his whole thinking and doing right now. He hasn't said a lot. It is possible that Mitch McConnell is all out of fucks to give. It is possible that after all this time that he has nothing to lose. Susan's shaking her head. Maybe Mitch McConnell is Mitch McConnell.
I am shaking my head because if we're betting on Mitch McConnell to save democracy at this point, folks,
we're really screwed.
Let me just add John Thune to the mix. Is it possible that he becomes something of an antagonist?
No, it is not. No, it is not. Okay. There may be other nominees. I want to clarify so that people don't misinterpret what I'm saying. There may be other nominees who go down. Tulsi Gabbard has literally spent the last several years parroting Russian talking points and supporting the dictator of Syria. She may be one. The nominee for the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, obviously is another who could just, be a bridge too far for McConnell and other senators. So I'm not saying that there aren't other nominees who could go down, but the idea that they will be some kind of an opposition or playing some Mitt Romney-like role, or even, frankly, a Bob Corker-like role, I just don't see that happening.
What do you mean by Bob? I think we know about Romney. What do you mean by Bob Corker-like role?
Well, Corker was publicly critical and in very scathing terms at times of Donald Trump while also working with him and his White House at times. Eventually, it became too much for him and he stomped out, in part because he couldn't bear to not tell the truth. And Mitch McConnell has never shown any sign of being unable to lie to us. In fact, he seems very comfortable doing that, even when it comes to Donald Trump. So
I'm just actually playing out a positive scenario, because trust me, I have all the negative scenarios because we have lived them. We all have PTSD about this. We've all seen Susan Collins, he's learned his lesson and all that. But the math of the Senate is somewhat interesting. I listed 3 things that Donald Trump didn't get from the Senate. Actually, it was 4. The election of John Thune. John Thune is not going to be an opponent, but he was not MAGA's candidate. So there is in the cloakroom, with the closed doors, we're not going to do this, maybe withdraw them. Maybe there won't be an up or down vote on some of these folks. But if you have Murkowski and Collins and Cassidy and Tillis and Mike Rounds, who's actually kind of a serious guy when it comes to foreign policy, and Mitch McConnell saying to one another, you know what, we're not potted plants. We don't have to go along with this. We do not want our first votes to be for a Russian asset or for, Pete Hegseth, who we ought to mention has been credibly accused of rape and paid a woman off. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when that alone would have been disqualifying, not to mention all the other stuff. But Donald Trump has flipped a middle finger to the Senate. He's challenged their institutional integrity, their power. He's activated whatever institutional instincts that might be latent there. I agree with Susan that if we're counting on them to save democracy, we are totally screwed. But on the other hand, we have seen these moments. There have not been the recess appointments. They did not elect Rick Scott as the majority leader. They did not roll over for Matt Gaetz. They're not going to roll over on abolishing the filibuster. Okay, so, and again, I'm going against my own grain of pessimism here, but I do think this is a scenario. And Mitch McConnell's 82 years old. He's not running again. He has nothing to lose. Donald Trump spent the last few years making racist slurs about his wife, insulting him over and over again. All Mitch has to do is sit in his office and go, no, I'm not doing that. And, here are my buddies. If I'm not doing that, maybe 1 or 2 others might not do that. I don't know. But it's an interesting moment. And I do think it's going to come down. I'm very interested to see what they do with Hegseth and with Tulsi Gabbard. I thought that if they derailed Gaetz, that it would make it harder for them to oppose other nominees because MAGA would be so inflamed. Actually, it might not work that way. It might actually say, hey, you know what? We are United States senators. We have some agency here. He wants to make us basically potted plants. We don't want to be. So who knows? Who knows? Susan's almost certainly right. I'm almost certainly wrong.
Look, one way of putting it is, what they've stood up for is pretty damn modest, having some advice and consent role. I mean, it was so it's the potted plant part of this, Charlie, that I think went too far. Not to say he didn't do it on purpose, trying to go too far. But what killed Gaetz to me is it became, not the ethics committee, it became clear he was going to have a background investigation, talk to the FBI, talk to others. No way he could have survived that. So by the simple suggestion or insistence, we actually have a role to play and there's a process. That is what foiled him. And, that's, I agree, very, very modest in the overall scheme of things.
2 points. One, you just touched on another norm that for now seems to be holding, and that is the FBI background checks. Remember, they wanted to confirm people without them at all. Now, there's been perhaps a less horrible incarnation, still norm-breaking, where people are going to go into the White House without sufficient FBI clearance and they'll get it later, and by then the FBI will be corrupted. But as far as the nominees going, you did have Lisa Murkowski. You had Kevin Kramer, who's no squish, basically say, no, we kind of like the FBI background check. And because you have that there, it might be a little bit of a safeguard. I don't think, however, we should overinterpret the Matt Gaetz situation. He made the one cardinal error that you can never make in the Congress, and that is he was an asshole to his colleagues. And if he hadn't been such a jerk and so hated, he may have made it through. We just don't know. If we want to defeat Tulsi Gabbard, we shouldn't necessarily be digging up stuff on the Russians. We should be looking through and seeing what nasty things she said about the senators or the congressman or Trump, because this is so personalized and everything is about their own ego, their own personality, their own, pride, that if you can get someone on something like that, he might have gotten through. Who knows? Now, Tulsi Gabbard, it would, just to underscore, this would be a calamity. We would have no assurance that agents around the world would remain safe. We'd have no ability to share information with our allies. It would be catastrophic. And I tend to think that they will figure out some way to kind of get by that. But it's going to be, I think, that RFK Jr. makes it through. Well, maybe he's disrailed by another sexual assault, because we haven't even spoken about surrounding himself with rapists and sexual assaulters and abusers, which is very, very on the nose for authoritarian, regimes. But we're going to get down to the situation. It's like Pam Bondi. She's awful. She's not horrific. And that's going to be kind of the standard that I think the Senate is going to land on.
Define deviancy down.
Yes, exactly. I mean, now, my God, Marco Rubio looks like George Marshall.
It's really true.
He does.
He's never looked so good. Yeah.
That's a level of horrible that we're operating with. And we have to remember that there is no confirmation process for the people who may have the most power. As we know, in many administrations, the State Department doesn't really do much of anything. They negotiate little, side deals with inconsequential countries, and all the power is in the NSC and is in the White House. That may well be. And Marco Rubio is just a way to get him out of the Senate. Again, personal corruption, so he can get Laura Trump into the Senate. That's how bizarre I think the staffing is going to go.
We'll see. It'll be interesting, in fact, to see who is appointed to that Senate seat in Florida that you're talking about, Marco Rubio's. I think Kremlinology dictates that we look who is sitting with Trump in these photographs at dinner at Mar-a-Lago. Who is accompanying Donald Trump to the UFC fighting event in Madison Square Garden? Who is eating McDonald's with him on his private plane? It's RFK Jr. And Marco Rubio is nowhere to be found. It's Don Jr. And then little, Mike Johnson is like jumping in the up in the background, like, hey guys, pick me. And it's first of all an unseemly look for a constitutional officer. I can't remember another Speaker of the United States House of Representatives who was so desperate for the approval and attention of the president. It's not the behavior of a co-equal branch of government, that's for sure. And I've literally never seen anything like a Speaker of the House traveling in the entourage of a would-be president, a candidate, and then a president-elect in the way that Mike Johnson has been chasing after Donald Trump. Look, it's the only way he can survive in the job. We all recognize that political reality, but it does speak to the constitutional imbalance here. Just to clarify quickly on Charlie's strong points, I do think that we're going to be redefining what checks and balances mean in the next few years, and it's certainly far better than the alternative that Gates's nomination should implode so quickly. It does speak to, okay, well, we now know a senator's red line is this. Is that where the line should be? No, of course not. Is it better than the alternative? Sure. I think that to the point about, Donald Trump has been insulting Mitch McConnell and calling his wife racist names. Well, he did that before Mitch McConnell endorsed him for re-election.
Yes.
So, nobody put a gun to Mitch McConnell's head and forced him to endorse Donald Trump for president after everything that has gone on, right? So he chose to do that.
He also chose, as Charlie points out, to say that he was guilty and deserved conviction on the impeachment and then decided not to do it. So first, I just want to say we are in the relentlessly dark place where I think we need to be, at least this week. And let me now move then to the dismissal of the federal cases against Trump. The top line, right, has to be what the F and what will history sort of do with this unbelievable turn of events?
This is one where I am fully prepared for this panel to convince me that I was unfair, because I wrote that kind of in the heat of the moment. saying, Merrick Garland and Jack Smith gave up. We knew how this was going to end. We knew that Donald Trump was going to quash this. We knew that he was going to place himself above the law, but they let him off the hook. They did his dirty work for him. And I just thought that at some point, if you spend years and years and years saying, this is an existential threat to the constitutional order, then you don't just give up on all of this. Now, it's not Jack Smith's fault. Jack Smith probably had no alternative given his position. I mean, you have to blame the electorate. You have to blame the senators for not holding him accountable. You have to blame Merrick Garland for being so slow, all of those factors. But I guess I would like to get some pushback. The Friday before, the Washington Post reports that Trump is going to fire the entire Jack Smith team, including the career lawyers who are normally insulated from that, and then that we know what he's going to do to the Justice Department. All of the norms, all of the guidelines are going to be destroyed. The next business day, Merrick Garland and Jack Smith basically say, we are going to be dropping all of these charges. I don't buy the argument that they left it open by saying it's without prejudice, because this is never going to happen. They're never going to bring them back. I hope that they still will issue a report, but we've had the reports. I don't know. What do you think? Again, maybe I was a little bit harsh on Jack Smith, who I admire a great deal, but the cataclysmic failure and just I guess it was the all of the surrenders, all of the failures that led up to what happened on Monday, where Donald Trump basically gets away with absolutely everything. He was going to get away. I just wish the Biden administration, Department of Justice, had not been the ones to do it. So tell me that I'm wrong and unfair.
And by the way, Merrick Garland is responsible directly for this. And just to get a little inside baseball, Jack Smith went to OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, to get an opinion saying he had to dismiss it. He didn't have to go to OLC. Going to OLC meant he was going to get this answer and he was going to have to dismiss. Now, who do you think told him to go to OLC? That's Merrick Garland. This is Merrick Garland being, I don't even want to say the Boy Scout, because Boy Scout denotes a certain moral code that one has the courage then to follow through. He is just peculiarly, uniquely, entirely unsuited to this office at this time. And for that, I hate to say it, I do blame Joe Biden. Joe Biden picked him. They knew what they were getting. Just like when they picked him for the position on the Supreme Court. He's always the wrong guy at the wrong time. And he is uniquely incapable of understanding, as Justice Gorsuch said, for the ages. What does this say for the future? Yes, you can say on one hand, oh, it would have been fruitless to go on, futile, it would get dismissed. But how it is dismissed matters. The fact that they did it themselves, and that entitles Trump to go out there and say, see, their case fell apart. They never had anything on me. To avoid the specter of Trump, in effect, firing people he shouldn't be firing. This is the Saturday Night Massacre to the hilt. And by the way, in the Saturday Night Massacre, when they reached down and they found someone to do it, that did make a difference. He did pay a price for that, Richard Nixon. What if they had just followed his lead and said, fine, we're going to fire the special counsel? What would have happened then? Would there have been the outroar that eventually led to Nixon's demise? Maybe, maybe not. But he is so incapable of understanding that it's not just a legal job at the Justice Department. It is a political job, and it's where the intersection of law and politics happens. And his failure to appreciate his role in the larger constitutional picture and in the demise of our democracy, he will go down, and I don't say this lightly, as the worst attorney general in history.
It's a sign of my great respect and admiration for Jen that I invited her and always invite her, knowing we were going to get this broadside against Garland, with which I diametrically disagree. Now, I'm in the minority here, but there's so much to say about Garland, and maybe the time to say it will be when he steps down. But let me first answer Charlie's question and say why no, this is actually a smart move. Look, first, doing OLC means they do it based on the current law. Yes, taking account of unprecedented circumstances, but it made the DOJ do it for current reasons rather than abject lawlessness and caprice. And it is a smart move, I think, Charlie. It's got to be a long shot, but they're playing a long game. But to keep it alive without prejudice, courts will accept a dismissal without prejudice. And I don't see how they get out of it. I've talked to a lot of sophisticated criminal law practitioners. Are they going to go in now and try to revive it and refile and then dismiss with prejudice? That's precarious. And it just remains alive in some way, even if you think it's a long shot. That's, I think, got to be really galling for Trump. They made the clean point. This is totally for this happenstance. We believe in the merits of this case, and that makes it, historically, it blunts the argument that, of course, Trump made right away that somehow this represented some kind of exculpation. Now, back to Garland, we don't have a ton of time, but just get out your calendar, listeners, and assume that he comes in as Attorney General, raring to go, and brings charges right away against Trump, which would have really been foolhardy at the time, and then play it out. We do not get there. He was going to get Eileen Cannon, and was going to get the Supreme Court. These are not final cases. Trump can do exactly the same thing. And even if somehow his lookout should have been, when so many people were thinking Trump is done now, I better do this just in case he runs again and wins. You don't get there. We'll continue to fight about this, but a lot did happen. I think they could have brought in Smith somewhat earlier, but a lot went on before they finally did.
I'll let the debate stand as a debate between you and Jen, but I do want to point out a couple things, that the failure of thinking, the failure of imagination that led to this crisis was one from President Biden on down throughout his administration. It was a failure to understand that Donald Trump could in fact come back from what they viewed as the unthinkable, unspeakable offenses of January 6th and the months that led up to it. And that was a failure that does belong rightfully on Joe Biden's lap, as well as that of his appointees, including the Attorney General. I've been haunted.
They had a lot of company, however, right?
Harry, that is how we're in this situation. And it's not exculpatory to say they had a lot of company. And by the way, there were plenty of people, including perhaps on this conversation, who understood on the night of January 6th, when Republican members of the U.S. House walked over the broken glass of the U.S. Capitol, and 2/3 of the House Republican Conference nonetheless continued to vote their false, really libel of our election and say that there had been something untoward that meant that they could not certify the election. 2/3 of the House Republican Conference did that on January 6th. And guess what? To me, that was very clear that Donald Trump was not going to be exiled forever from these people. And there was no other leader. If the Republican Party hadn't been, essentially a rotten shell, he wouldn't have been able to take it over in the first place. And I've been haunted by a quote in the most recent Woodward book that he attributes to Ron Klain, the first White House chief of staff of Joe Biden, in the weeks after Biden's inauguration in 2021, where he says basically Donald Trump is a sideshow. He's irrelevant and we don't need to pay attention to him. And that is the reason that the Justice Department of the Biden administration took the position that it did. And now that's number one. Number two, I just want to point out, because I don't have a fixed view, and I appreciate hearing both of your different views as far as the legal tactics go and whether it was preferable or not. I think as a matter of politics, Donald Trump and his team claims this is complete vindication and they don't give a hoot, about the niceties. But I would ask all of you, because I'm interested in this, and maybe we don't have time, but I don't hear a lot of self-examination among the legal commentariat about whether this was the right move or not, right? And, I understand, right, like, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. The same could be said of the political operatives. I spent an hour plus of my life that I can't get back listening to those Harris campaign operatives like justifying themselves on Pod Save America by saying over and over again, oh my God, we didn't have enough time. That is not a very intellectually compelling theory of the case as to why Donald Trump was just reelected. And by the same token, I would just say, I don't know the answer to this, but I would ask all of the kind of legal thinkers out there, was it the right idea? What have we learned from this incredible failed effort, beside the fact that it was an incredible screw up by Biden and everyone around him to think that Trump couldn't come back? Aside from that, which my guess is we can all stipulate to, what have we learned about whether it was a good idea or not to do this? I don't know the answer.
Couple things. One, to your point, Harry, Garland didn't have to come in and file a case against Donald Trump immediately. He could have done a few months of investigation, brought all these guys in, and not done this stupid bottom-up kind of nonsense that never brought any kind of fruit because there wasn't a connection from the bottom up anyway and was a giant waste of time. And we all knew the crime. We'd seen it on TV. And I think at that time, when at least it was relatively fresh in people's mind, I do not think that they would have gotten blowback by filing the January 6th case. Now, I would entertain the argument about state prosecutions. I do not think, compatible with the Constitution, you could have not investigated and indicted Donald Trump. It was not until the Supreme Court decided, in their worst decision since Dred Scott, to make a results-oriented nonsense argument that no one thought was correct, including those 3 judges on the DC Circuit, that there was some kind of broad criminal immunity that went to the heart, that really distorted the very essence of our constitutional system. That's what made it kind of impossible, plus the delay. Had we had a Supreme Court that was mildly conscientious, mildly respectful of the constitutional system, they would not have delayed for 6 months plus. We would have gotten a ruling, and had Merrick Garland moved expeditiously, we would have gotten a conviction. By the way, that doesn't mean the American people still wouldn't have elected him. No. We are so far past legal and moral norms as a basis for making the presidential pick that would have been even more horrible. But I will go to my grave cursing Merrick Garland and cursing the Supreme Court, because they ultimately have thrown the Constitution to the wolves and have, I think, helped propound the notion that the Supreme Court has given the current president carte blanche. Who's going to argue with that?
There's much that I agree with, but if they don't care about the convictions themselves, we still would have been at a point where Trump could have vaporized them, because that point that it would be too late is when it has worked through all the appeals, including the Supreme Court. Like right now, we're still a few years away from that, even with Harris win.
A mild defense of Merrick Garland that he stepped into the wrong movie. He thought that he was going to be Edward Levy, that he was going to restore the integrity of the Justice Department, and therefore went out of his way to be non-political. So there was a theory to the case. That's number one. Number two, counterexample to the way this all played out, Brazil, of all places. Brazil has managed to hold Bolsonaro legally, or at least they've indicted him for his role in the coup. So Brazil was able to do something that the United States of America was not able to do. Final. Can we just talk about this OLC memo that says you cannot indict or prosecute a president? This is not the law. This is a memo. This is a policy decades old. And in effect, what it says is that the president during his term in office is immune from any criminal prosecution. It is a form of recognizing that he is above the law, confers upon him or her immunity. For Merrick Garland and the Biden administration to invoke that now endorses that policy without, I think, the kind of debate that we should have had. We're all indignant about what the Supreme Court did with immunity, but the OLC memo also confirms a form of immunity that I think ought to be the subject of more debate in the legal community than it is, But now, Biden administration, Merrick Garland, Jack Smith have basically said, yeah, that's our policy, and we are going to act in accordance with it. So there's something not just tactical, but that endorsement, I think, that OLC memo is going to haunt us along with that Supreme Court decision for a very, very long time.
Forbearance is not immunity. That really what you have to forbear during the terms. That's very different than immunity both before and after.
Great discussion, guys, and more on this part, I think, to come. But all the stuff on Trump, this is where I think we really, really are, and I'm proud that Talking Feds is digging deep and dark. We have 1 minute left for our Talking Five question, which is, as we're at year's end, the McQuarrie's Dictionary, I haven't heard of it before, but it has chosen as its word of the year, and shittification. What is yours?
All right, I have one. This is a hat tip to my friend Constanze Selzenmuller. During the first Trump administration, I asked her to help me come up with what must surely be a long German word for the state of constant anxiety generated by Donald Trump being the president of the United States and all that implies in terms of its chaos and dysfunction. And she consulted and she came back with, I think, a brilliant word that should certainly be our word of the year. I will give you the long form and then the Constanza approved short form. That's much easier to say. And by the way, I'm
the Académie Française version, yeah.
Exactly. I'm not a German speaker, but here's the long form. Trump Regierung Schlamassel-Schmerz. And the short form, I'm glad I've got you laughing with that one. The short form is it just trips off the tongue in comparison. Trump Schmerz.
Ooh.
And I think that we are all suffering and will be for the next 4 years from Trump Schmerz.
Maybe we should just surrender immediately.
We're not going to beat that.
Yeah. What do you got? Anything?
Okay, so I to be honest with you, I think shittification is perfect. I mean, it began as a description of social media, the way they make the experience worse and worse and worse. And of course, what Elon Musk has done to what used to be known as Twitter is the shittification of Twitter. But I think we're about to see the shittification of the federal government following the shittification of our culture and politics in 2024. My second choice would be the term skeevy chode, which I use to describe Mr. Gates. And my only real fear over the next 4 years is that I run out of synonyms for dickhead. So I offer, until it becomes a cliche, skeevy chode.
And there's always German. Okay, Jen Rubin?
Oh, gosh. There's so many words. Depression, down the drainism, Trumpism. But I'm just going to go with the tried and true, and that's autocracy. That's kind of where we're headed.
That's the word.
And people say, well, this is not Adolf Hitler. No, but it's something very, very bad. And that thing is autocracy. And we're looking more like Orban every day. There's a reason why he's so popular in Trump land.
I just got to say that is such an important point. You talk about ways in which things overlap or are similar to 1933, and it's, you're calling him a Hitler. Well, actually, sort of, but it's not the point. The real nightmare we're looking at is, 4 years from now, we're kind of like Hungary. And guess what? When that happens, you don't go back. That might be a good word to try, not being able to go back-ism. But I spent the episode with 10% of my brain trying to come up with a good new word, and I think it shows the difficulty of multitasking and the challenges of growing old. But there is one out there. Charlie used it twice, but it's so good for its music and its puerile quality. So I am going with Kakistocracy. We tape on Wednesday. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks so much, you Talking Feds MVPs, for being with us. All good things, all things considered, in the coming weeks, months, and years. So I think we're down to 214 weeks till January 2029. Thank you so much, Susan, Jen, and Charlie. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. And here's an up-to-the-minute bulletin. Talking Feds is now on Substack. Check us out at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, trying to break down the various threats out there to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producers Gabriella Glick and Becca Havian, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.